There is a planet that should not exist, a world so hostile, so alien, so utterly indifferent to human life that every instinct says, nothing lives here, nothing survives here. And yet it became the most important place in the known universe. Before we go any further, and this is something I always want to say early, the background footage in our videos is just atmosphere. It doesn't matter. You don't need to watch it. Put your phone face down, close your eyes, pull the blanket up. This is a listening experience. The story is what matters, and it's going to be here with you the whole way through. So settle in, because we're going to go all the way back, before the Atreides, before the Harkonnens, before Paul, before anyone you know from the story. We're going back to when Arrakis was just a wound in the galaxy, old, bleeding, and completely misunderstood. This is the complete history of Arrakis. Arrakis is a desert planet. That description doesn't do it justice. When we say desert, most of us think of the Sahara. Vast, yes. Brutal, yes. But crossable. There are oases. There are edges. The Sahara has coasts on either end of it. Arrakis has no coasts. There is no sea. There is no river. There are no lakes hidden in the lowlands. There is nothing that was ever water. Or if there was, it is gone in a way so complete that the rock itself has forgotten it. The planet is a single continuous wound of sand and heat and wind, broken only by the shield wall in the north, a massive geological formation of rock, old and enormous, that separates the deep desert from the polar regions. The polar regions are the only places where temperatures drop enough for limited moisture to exist. Even there, life is not easy. Life is just marginally less impossible. Think about that for a second. The most habitable region of Arrakis is the polar zones, and even those are barely survivable without extraordinary adaptation. The deep desert, the erg, the open sand sea, is something else entirely. Temperatures during the day exceed anything a human body can withstand without full body protection. Nights drop fast and hard. The winds carry sand at velocities that strip exposed skin in minutes. And beneath the surface, moving through the sand like living submarines, are the great sandworms. The worms are ancient beyond reckoning. There is no reliable record of when they first appeared. The earliest human surveys of Arrakis found them already enormous, already fully integrated into the planet's ecosystem, already the dominant life form by any conceivable measure. They are not predators in any normal sense. They don't hunt. They don't need prey. They are more like geological forces, immense, slow in their cycles, but capable of explosive speed when they choose to surface. A mature sandworm can reach lengths of 400 meters. Some legends among the Fremen speak of worms much larger than that. Grandfather worms, ancient beyond counting. So massive they barely register individual humans as anything worth noticing. And here is the thing nobody fully understood for centuries, even with all the imperial science and all the guild analysis trained on this one planet. The sandworms and the spice are the same thing. Not metaphorically, not ecologically, literally. The spice melange is a product of the sandworm life cycle. The pre-spice mass, a biological bloom that forms deep underground, explodes to the surface when water contacts it, producing the heady orange cloud of raw spice that the Fremen call the water of life in one of its forms. The sand plankton, the tiny organisms that cover the desert floor like an invisible carpet, feed on the spice. The sand trout, flat, leathery creatures that seem primitive compared to the great worms, encapsulate water sources to keep the deep desert dry, because water is lethal to the pre-spice mass. The sand trout eventually transform. They grow. They become sandworms. The sandworms are therefore not just the apex life form of Arrakis. They are the spice producers. They are the water controllers. They are the reason the planet is what it is. Remove the sandworms, and Arrakis changes completely. Keep the sandworms, and nothing else on this planet can fully thrive. But the spice flows. This is the paradox that Arrakis has held since before humans arrived. The planet is hostile precisely because of what makes it valuable. The poison is the medicine. The desert is the garden, if you know how to see it right. For most of recorded history, humans didn't. The first humans to reach Arrakis were not colonists in any planned sense. They were deposited, left, marooned in a manner so old that the records have blurred past the point of clarity. The Zen-Sunni wanderers. You need to understand something about the pre-imperial era of the Dune universe to understand who these people were. The Butlerian Jihad, the great war against thinking machines that reshaped all of human civilization, had ended. The old order was shattered. Humanity was scattered and scarred, rebuilding itself across 100 worlds without the artificial intelligence it had come to depend on. In that chaos, in that massive reorganization of power and population, certain groups fell through the cracks. The Zen-Sunni were one of those groups, a religious community with roots in ancient earth, a blended tradition drawing from Sunni Islam and Zen Buddhism, combined over centuries of displacement into something that was its own thing entirely. They were not politically powerful. They were not wealthy. They were, by the standards of their era, inconvenient. They were enslaved, moved from planet to planet over generations. Poritrin, Salusa Secundus, Bella Tegeus, Rossack, Grumman. Each time they were moved, their numbers thinned. Each time they were settled somewhere new, the place proved unsuitable or dangerous. They were being worked down, slowly, through displacement and hardship. Arrakis was the last stop. Whether they were intentionally abandoned there, or whether they simply stayed when no one came back to move them again, is not entirely clear from the oldest records. What is clear is that a remnant of the Zen-Sunni wanderers found themselves on one of the most hostile planets in the known universe, with almost nothing, and had to decide whether to die or to change. They chose to change. The transformation took generations, centuries. It was not a conscious decision made by a single leader or council. It was a slow, grinding, evolutionary adaptation, biological, cultural, and spiritual. The people who eventually became the Fremen were not born from that original group. They were built from it, shaped by the desert the way a stone is shaped by a river, slowly, completely, and without mercy. The early Zen-Sunni settlers on Arrakis lost many things. They lost easy access to water. They lost the religious structures that couldn't survive desert conditions. They lost traditions that assumed you had enough food, enough shelter, enough comfort to observe them. They lost the assumption that life was a given. What they kept, and what they strengthened, was the core of their spiritual understanding. The idea that this world was a trial, that the desert was not an enemy to be overcome, but a teacher to be respected. That waste of water, of life, of any resource was the deepest sin. That death was not the end of the conversation. And slowly, generation by generation, they went deeper into the desert, because here is what the early settlers discovered that nobody on the outside would believe for a very long time. The deep desert, for all its apparent hostility, could shelter you if you knew how. The great rock formations, the hidden sietch, cave systems carved by ancient geology, sealed by the Fremen themselves against wind and sand. The stillsuit, developed over generations into one of the most sophisticated pieces of human technology ever produced, not because it uses advanced materials, but because it understands the body perfectly, capturing every gram of moisture from breath, from sweat, from waste, recycling it back through a closed system that lets a person survive in conditions that should be fatal. The early Fremen didn't have all of this at once. They built it across centuries. They paid for each innovation in lives, in children who didn't make it through the first summer, in elders who died before passing on what they'd learned, in entire communities that chose the wrong rock formation and were buried by a storm, or surfaced at the wrong time and were found by a worm. The desert doesn't care about your effort. It only registers your result. But the Fremen got results. Slowly, over 3,000 years between their first arrival and the events of the main story, they became something entirely new. Not quite human in the old sense. Not alien. Something forged. The people the desert made. At some point in this long history of human suffering on Arrakis, the outside universe noticed the spice. Or rather, the outside universe had always known the spice was there. Melange was being harvested from Arrakis since before the Fremen finished their transformation. But what the universe came to understand, gradually and then catastrophically, was what the spice actually did. Let's go through it, because this is where the history of Arrakis stops being a local story and becomes a galactic one. Melange extends life. This sounds simple. It is not simple. When taken consistently over years and decades, spice slows the aging process significantly. Wealthy people who could afford regular spice consumption lived notably longer than those who couldn't. This alone would make it valuable beyond measure. But that's not the important part. Melange enhances cognition. Again, this sounds modest. The reality is not modest. The human brain, operating under the influence of sustained spice exposure at the right levels, can do things that should not be possible. Pattern recognition expands. Foresight, not mystical, not supernatural, but an extreme form of intuitive calculation based on the reading of microsignals and probability, becomes accessible. The mind opens. The Spacing Guild figured this out before almost anyone else. The Guild navigators, the people responsible for folding space and guiding ships between the stars safely, without the use of thinking machines that the Butlerian Jihad had forbidden, were spice users. That was the open secret that was also not a secret at all. The navigators needed melange to do their job. They ingested it in quantities that transformed them, over time, into something that were not quite human anymore. Their bodies changed. Their consciousness expanded into something that could see the safe path through folded space. They could not be replaced by machines. They could not do their job without the spice. The entire interstellar economy of the Dune universe ran on guild transportation, and guild transportation ran on spice. The navigators were not a luxury. They were the infrastructure. Think about that for a second. Every star system, every planet, every shipment of goods, every troop movement, every political negotiation that required physical presence, all of it depended on ships that needed guild navigators, who needed melange from a single planet. One planet, one source, no substitute. Arrakis was not just important. Arrakis was the keystone of an entire civilization. Remove it, and everything falls apart. Control it, and you control everything. Not through force, not through politics, but through the simple logic of supply. The Bene Gesserit understood this too, though they valued the spice for different reasons. Their reverend mothers used mélange in their rituals. The water of life, the chemically altered bile of a drowned sandworm, processed through a Bene Gesserit's body and distributed to a sietch as a religious sacrament. This was the process by which a reverend mother unlocked access to her genetic memory, the accumulated lives of every female ancestor in her line. The spice was the key to an internal universe as vast as the external one. The mentats, the human computers trained to replace thinking machines, used mélange to enhance their calculations. The suit doctors used it. The noble houses used it. Everybody who was anybody in this civilization had threaded the spice into their lives so completely that they could not imagine existing without it. And all of it came from one world that most of them had never seen, managed by people who had been enslaved and abandoned there, and whom nobody took seriously. The irony was enormous. The Fremen lived on the most powerful real estate in the universe and were treated as savages. The galaxy bent its entire political and economic structure around a planet whose actual inhabitants were considered beneath notice. That imbalance would eventually produce something explosive, but not yet. First, we need to talk about what the Empire did with this leverage. The Emperor, specifically the Padishah Emperor of the House Carino, the ruling family for 10,000 years, understood Arrakis perfectly. He understood it so well that his approach to it was almost admirable in its cynicism. You do not hold Arrakis directly. That would be too obvious, too tempting to challenge. If the Emperor held the spice monopoly in his own name, every great house in the Landsraad, the council of noble families, would have an immediate and legitimate reason to unite against him. The balance of power, already delicate, would shatter. So instead, you lease it. The fief of Arrakis was held by a noble house under imperial charter. They administered the spice harvesting operations, maintained order, managed the native population, which is a polite way of saying they attempted to control the Fremen with varying degrees of brutality and failure, and delivered the spice tithe to the Spacing Guild and to the imperial coffers. In exchange, the ruling house got obscene wealth. They also got a target on their back, because here is the game that the Emperor was really playing. The house that held Arrakis was powerful enough to be a counterweight to the other great houses, but exposed enough to need imperial protection. And the Emperor could always threaten to revoke the fief, to give Arrakis to someone else, to tilt the balance however he needed. Arrakis was not a reward. Arrakis was a chain that looked like a crown. For 80 years before the events of the main story, House Harkonnen held Arrakis. Vladimir Harkonnen, the Baron, oversaw operations there for much of that time, and the Harkonnen approach to Arrakis was extraction without any consideration of sustainability whatsoever. They cared nothing for the Fremen. Less than nothing. The Fremen were an obstacle to production, a security risk, a nuisance to be minimized. The Harkonnen method was violence and exploitation. You harvest as much spice as possible. You keep the population intimidated enough not to organize. You report the minimum necessary to the Emperor. You skim the rest. This worked, after a fashion. The Harkonnens grew extraordinarily rich, but it did not work in the deeper sense. It did not actually control Arrakis. It never touched the reality of the planet. The Fremen in the deep desert were invisible to the Harkonnens. Not because the Harkonnens were stupid, though they underestimated the Fremen consistently, but because the Setches were genuinely invisible. The Fremen had 3,000 years of practice at not being found. They moved without leaving trails. They communicated without electronic signals. They lived in caves that the planetary surveys had never adequately mapped. They existed in the open desert, where no Harkonnen soldier would willingly go. And in those caves, over those 80 years, they were doing something. They were training. They were stockpiling. They were waiting for a sign. The Fremen had their own relationship to prophecy and expectation, seeded there over generations by Bene Gesserit missionaries who had their own long game in play. The Missionaria Protectiva, the Bene Gesserit practice of seeding religious legends on primitive worlds to create safe havens for their members, had been deployed on Arrakis centuries earlier. They had planted stories. The story of a Messiah, an off-worlder who would come to lead the Fremen to paradise, who would have powers beyond ordinary humans, who would know the language of the desert and understand the ways of the people. This was not genuine prophecy. It was social engineering. The Bene Gesserit had installed an expectation so that any sufficiently trained member of their order could step into the role if she needed sanctuary on Arrakis. But the Fremen had taken the legend and made it their own. They had added to it. They had shaped it to fit their specific hopes and their specific understanding of what needed to happen. The coming Messiah, the Mahdi, the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world, would lead them in a jihad. The desert would bloom. The worms would be freed. The off-worlders would be driven away. Arrakis would belong to its people. That was the dream, sitting in the Setches when House Harkonnen finally lost the fief. That was the pressure that had been building for 80 years. That was what the outside universe was about to accidentally detonate. The Emperor's decision to transfer Arrakis from House Harkonnen to House Atreides was not a reward. Everyone who was paying attention understood that immediately. House Atreides was the most popular noble house in the Landsraad. Duke Leto Atreides was admired, trusted, and, critically, was building a coalition of great houses that made the Emperor nervous. A duke who commanded that much loyalty was a duke who could become something more dangerous than a duke. The solution was elegant in a brutal way. Give Atreides Arrakis. It looks like a gift. It is a trap. The Harkonnens and the Emperor had an arrangement. Once Atreides was settled on Arrakis, once they had committed their forces and their reputation to the planet, the Harkonnens would return with Imperial Sarduka support, the Emperor's own elite troops fighting under Harkonnen colours, and destroy House Atreides completely. The family, the soldiers, everything. Arrakis would go back to the Harkonnens. The problem would be solved. The coalition would shatter without its centre. Leto knew it was a trap. His advisors knew it was a trap. They went anyway, because refusing would have been read as a challenge to the Emperor and produced a faster version of the same outcome. At least this way, they had time. At least this way, they might find something on Arrakis worth fighting for. When the Atreides landed at Arrakeen, the capital city in the northern reaches, something shifted on the planet. Not dramatically, Not in any way the Harkonnens or the Emperor could see, but the Fremen noticed. Duke Leto's approach to the Fremen was different from anything they had experienced from off-worlders. He wanted to make contact. He wanted to establish genuine alliance. His ecologist, the brilliant and complicated Dr. Kynes, who had spent his life on Arrakis and knew more about the planet than any living person who wasn't Fremen, served as the crucial bridge. And his son, Paul. Paul Atreides arrived on Arrakis at 15 years old. He had been trained his entire life by some of the finest minds in the Imperium. His mother, Lady Jessica, was Bene Gesserit, one of the Sisterhood's most gifted members, secretly a failed experiment in their long breeding program, someone who should have produced a daughter and had instead produced a son. That son had been given all of his mother's training, everything the Bene Gesserit had to teach about voice, about physical awareness, about reading people and situations with an accuracy that looked like magic from the outside. Paul was also something the Bene Gesserit hadn't fully anticipated. He was a genuine prescient, not the manufactured potential they'd been cultivating toward. The real thing, activated by proximity to the spice he'd been exposed to since before birth through his mother's bloodstream. He had been having visions his whole life. And when he arrived on Arrakis, the visions changed. They became more specific. He saw a young Fremen woman with blue in blue eyes. He saw the desert. He saw violence on a scale that frightened him. He saw himself at the center of something he could not stop. The first days and weeks on Arrakis were about orientation for the Atreides, learning the planet, learning the industry, trying to keep their people alive and functional in a place they didn't understand. For Paul, it was something else. It was the beginning of a gravitational pull toward a future that wanted to happen. Then the trap closed. The Harkonnen and Sardaukar attack came at night. It came through a traitor, the Atreides doctor, Yue, who had been compromised through the capture and torture of his wife by the Baron. A man whose imperial conditioning should have made betrayal impossible had been broken in the most human way possible, through love and grief, and the promise that his suffering might end. Yue disabled the defensive shields. The Sardaukar came in overwhelming numbers. The Atreides military, formidable by any normal standard, was not equipped to fight the Emperor's personal troops. Leto died. He died taking a poison gas capsule concealed in his own tooth, trying to kill the Baron in the chaos. He failed to kill the Baron. He died knowing that his house was destroyed, and his son was somewhere in the night and might be dead. The massacre was comprehensive. The Atreides soldiers who survived were scattered or captured. Arrakeen changed hands. The Harkonnens were back, and Paul and his mother were in the desert. Jessica carried the Ben Gesserit training that might keep them alive for another day. Paul carried the visions that were now sharpening into something he could almost navigate. They were taken prisoner briefly, transported over the open desert by Harkonnen officers who intended to drop them and let the desert finish what the attack had started. Clean hands, no bodies to find. But Paul and Jessica escaped. Into the desert. Into the place everyone who wasn't Fremen treated as certain death. In the open desert, trying to survive their first night, the Fremen found them instead. This is the pivot point. This is where the history of Arrakis stops being background and becomes destiny. The Fremen group that found them led by Stilgar, one of the great Naib leaders of the southern Setches, had every reason to kill them immediately. Every off-worlder was a potential threat, a potential spy. The desert did not do courtesy to strangers, but Paul demonstrated things in that encounter that stopped the calculation. He had been trained in combat styles the Fremen recognized, styles that came from their own traditions, filtered through generations and brought back to him through his Bene Gesserit inheritance. He knew things he should not have known. He moved in ways that should not have been possible for someone who had never been in the desert. He used the voice, the precise verbal technique that compels compliance, and it worked on people who had been partially conditioned against it by the Missionaria Protectiva's own embedded legends. The legend was walking toward them. Stilgar was not a credulous man. He was one of the shrewdest leaders among the Fremen, and even Stilgar could see that this was not a normal boy. They took Paul and Jessica to Siege, and the history of the universe quietly changed direction. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what a Sietch actually was, because it wasn't a camp, it wasn't a temporary shelter, it was a civilization. The great Sietches of the southern desert, Sietch Taba, where Stilgar led, was one of the most important, held thousands of people. Cave systems carved by geological charts and expanded by Fremen labor over generations, sealed with airlocks that maintained internal humidity at levels that were almost inconceivable by surface standards. Inside a Sietch, you could breathe without a stillsuit. Inside a Sietch, there was moisture in the air. There were children who had never felt the open desert wind. There were elders who remembered the elders who had begun the great project. The great project. This is what the outside universe completely failed to understand about the Fremen. They were not simply surviving. They were terraforming. Doctor, Kynes, and before him, his father, and before that, the Fremen visionaries who had accepted Kynes' father's plan, generations earlier, had set in motion a program to change Arrakis. The water table, buried impossibly deep, was being accessed. Wind traps, extraordinarily sophisticated devices that pulled moisture from the desert air at night, had been installed across vast stretches of the desert, each one adding incrementally to the water budget. Ecological testing stations maintained carefully shielded pockets of vegetation. A botanical census of every plant that could survive in desert conditions was being maintained and expanded. They were not trying to make Arrakis comfortable. They were trying to make it livable. They were 500 years into a plan projected to take 3 or 4 generations more. They were doing it in total secrecy, because if the Harkonnens had known, if the Emperor had known, the project would have been destroyed immediately, because a livable Arrakis with water meant a changed ecosystem. A changed ecosystem meant an uncertain future for the sandworms. An uncertain future for the sandworms meant an uncertain future for the spice. And the spice was the thing the whole galaxy needed, and nobody could allow anyone else to have an independent relationship with. The Fremen were, in secret, doing something that could have threatened the entire galactic order, and they understood that. They did it anyway, because it was their planet. Paul entered this world and began to learn it from the inside. He took a Fremen name, Usul, meaning the base of the pillar, his private name within the Sietch, and Muad'Dib, the name of the desert mouse that survived what nothing else could, his public name in the desert. He learned to ride the worms. He learned to move without rhythm, without the vibrations that attracted worms to the surface. He learned to call water as a sign of grief, understanding that for the Fremen, every tear was literally a giving of wealth. He also kept having visions, and the visions kept showing him the same thing: a holy war spreading outward from Arrakis across the entire Imperium. Billions dying in his name. The jihad he could not stop, no matter which path he chose. This terrified him. He tried to navigate around it. He could not find the angle. Every path he could see through his prescience led toward the same ocean of fire. His mother became something the Fremen had not had in a long time. A reverend mother. She took the water of life, the unconverted bile, the poison that kills anyone who cannot convert it, and she transformed it through Bene Gesserit training, becoming in that moment what only Bene Gesserit reverend mothers were supposed to be. And in doing so, she accidentally changed her unborn daughter. The child she was carrying, Alia, was exposed to the full ancestral memory in the womb. Alia was born Fremen. Alia was born with the memories of every woman in her line, fully accessible from birth. She was something that had never existed before. The Fremen called it abomination, and also called it a holy sign, and both things were probably true. 2 years passed in the desert. 2 years of Paul becoming Fremen, becoming Muad'Dib, becoming something the visions had been preparing him for. 2 years of the Fremen watching and deciding. Let me stay here for a moment before we reach the battle, because this part of the story gets rushed when it shouldn't. The Fremen had built something remarkable. Not just the ecological project, not just the still suits and the thumpers and the maker hooks for riding worms. They had built a culture that was wholly adapted to scarcity in a way that no comfortable civilization fully grasps. Water was not a resource. Water was sacred. When a Fremen died, their water was reclaimed. The body was processed, carefully, with respect, but completely, and the water returned to the community's hidden cisterns. This was not macabre. This was survival, shaped into ritual. The dead gave their last gift. Nothing was wasted. The community continued. Grief, for the Fremen, was expressed by the offering of water from your own eyes. Tears were the most expensive thing a person could give. When the Fremen wept for you, they were giving you something real, something measured, something that cost them in the most fundamental currency of their world. Fighting ability determined rank among the men. Leadership was earned and could be challenged. The naib of a sietch could be challenged by any man who wanted to take his place. Single combat, to the death. This wasn't barbarism. This was adaptation. In a world where every person's competence was survival critical, you could not afford to be led by someone past their prime who was holding the position through political maneuvering. The sietch needed its best fighter in charge. Paul had to fight for his place. He fought a young Fremen named Jameis, who challenged him early in his time in the sietch, and won. The weight of that death stayed with him, not because killing troubled him in the abstract, but because Jameis, for all his aggression, was a man with people who loved him. The widow, Hara, became Paul's responsibility by Fremen custom. The Fremen don't do sentiment about the mechanics of survival, but they do absolute responsibility. Chani was the woman from his visions, the blue in blue eyes. Stilgar's best fighter, daughter of the ecologist kinds. deeply practical and deeply capable, and at the same time, fully immersed in the emerging belief that Paul might be what the legends described. Shani did not easily believe. That was part of what made her valuable as a partner. She tested the belief against reality, and reality kept holding. Paul loved her, not in the way of the great houses, not a political love or a transactional one. He loved her the way people love when they have very little else to hold on to. And that love was woven into the visions. She was there in the future he was trying to navigate, in the versions where something survived worth surviving. The Fremen were also becoming something more organized under his influence. Paul had military training that the Fremen had never encountered in this form. He taught them new fighting disciplines. He helped formalize structures that let the disparate setches communicate and coordinate. He was not imposing himself, or he was trying not to. But a leader shapes what's around him, whether he intends to or not. And Paul Atreides, trained from birth to lead, was shaping the Fremen into an army. That was the other thing the outside universe didn't know. In the 2 years while the Harkonnens congratulated themselves on eliminating the Atreides, the desert had been militarizing. The moment of transition came when it had to. Paul consumed the water of life, took the risk his mother had taken, the risk that should have killed him, and emerged from it as something that had fully unlocked. The visions resolved into a kind of sight that was not exactly sight. He could see the threads of possibility spreading forward in time. He could see the paths. He could see which ones led where. And he made his choice. The spice harvester had been sabotaged. The Harkonnen hold on Arrakis was weakening from internal pressure. The Emperor himself had come to the planet, a sign of how seriously the situation had degraded, because Padishah emperors did not personally travel to problem worlds without reason. His Sardauka were present in force. Paul called the attack during a massive desert storm, the kind of storm that grounded aircraft, that made navigation nearly impossible, that the Harkonnens would never have imagined anyone willingly operating within. He rode a worm into it. The Fremen rode with him. They used atomics on the shield wall. The great northern barrier that protected the capital from the deep desert was breached. Through that gap poured the open desert, wind and sand and worms, and 50,000 Fremen who had been waiting for this moment for 2 years, for a generation, for 3,000 years, depending on how you measured it. The Sardaukar were among the finest soldiers in the Imperium. They had never lost. The reputation of the Imperial military was built on their invincibility. They met the Fremen fighters in the passes below the wall and discovered, possibly for the first time in their existence, what it was like to be outmatched. The Fremen fought in the way that only people who have trained their whole lives in conditions that would kill anyone else can fight. They were faster. They were more acclimatized. They understood the terrain the way their enemies never could. And they had numbers. Not just Paul's Siege, not just Taba, but the consolidated fighting force of every major southern siege, gathered in secret over months. The battle was not long. That's the strange thing about the end of some of the most important conflicts in history. They end quickly, when the balance finally tips. The Harkonnens broke almost immediately. The Sardaukar held longer, but they were fighting in sand, in a storm, against an enemy that seemed to emerge from the desert itself. They held, and then they broke too. The Baron Harkonnen was killed, not in the battle's main action, by a child. Alia, Paul's sister, born with the full force of ancestral memory already present, confronted the Baron in the chaos and drove a Gom Jabbar into him, the weapon of the Bene Gesserit, used by a girl who was not quite 3 years old by outside reckoning, and who had been a full consciousness since before her birth. The Emperor was taken, captured, essentially, as his forces collapsed around him. Paul stood in the ruins of Arrakis and made his demands. He would take the Emperor's daughter, Princess Irulan, as his political wife. Not his true wife, not the woman he loved, but the vessel of legitimacy that would transfer the Carino throne to a new reality. He threatened to destroy the spice, to blow the ecological transformation program and seal every spice vein on the planet, ensuring that the worms could not produce melange for a generation. The Guild's navigators would go blind. The Empire would fall apart without the ships to hold it together. Nobody doubted him. That was the key thing. He had already done what everyone said was impossible. The threat was entirely believable. The imperial houses capitulated. The deal was made. Paul Atreides became Muad'Dib, Emperor in fact, if not yet in title, the leader of the Fremen, the holder of Arrakis. And the jihad began, because Paul had seen it coming and could not stop it. The true believers took the fire he had lit and carried it outward across the stars, and billions died in the years that followed, in the name of a man who had never wanted to be a god. That is where the first great arc of Arrakis' story ends. Not in triumph, in ambivalence, in the recognition that winning exactly what you fought for can still be a kind of loss, if the winning itself becomes something you cannot control. But Arrakis does not stop when Paul's story enters its next chapter. The planet has never been a backdrop. It is a protagonist, and its story continues. The jihad that spread from Arrakis in Paul's name lasted roughly 12 years. When it ended, the Imperium was remade. House Carino was reduced. The Spacing Guild remained, because it had to. The spice kept flowing. The navigators kept needing it. The Bene Gesserit reoriented their long programs around the new reality. The Landsraad adjusted. And on Arrakis itself, something began to shift. The ecological transformation program continued. The wind traps and the moisture farming, and the carefully managed water budget that the Fremen had been building for generations. It was now being accelerated, with Atreides' power behind it, with resources the Fremen had never had access to before. The project moved faster. Green things began to appear in the northern regions. Small expanses of vegetation, experimental, fragile, but real. The Fremen were divided about this. Here is the tension that runs through everything that comes after Paul's victory. The dream of transforming Arrakis and the reality of what a transformed Arrakis would mean were not the same thing. The Sietch communities had been built entirely around water scarcity. Their culture, their religion, their social structures, their identity, all of it was shaped by the desert. A green Arrakis was not the Fremen's Arrakis. A planet with rivers and open water and a survivable surface was a planet where the Fremen's hard-won adaptations were no longer advantages. And there was the sandworm problem. Water was lethal to the worms. As the water table changed, as surface moisture increased in the transformed zones, the worms retreated. The spice production in those areas decreased. The sand trout, responding to the ecological disruption, worked overtime to encapsulate the new water sources. But the scale was too large. The balance that had existed for millennia was beginning to shift. or Paul himself. In the years before he walked into the desert blind, following the ancient Fremen tradition of a leader whose usefulness had been ended by physical incapacity, was deeply ambivalent about the transformation. He could see what it would do. He had prescience, and he could see that a truly green Arrakis was also an Arrakis without worms. And without worms, the spice died. And without the spice, the entire civilization he had just overturned collapsed into a different kind of chaos. The tension was not resolved in his generation. It was handed off. Aaliyah ruled as regent for Paul's young children after he walked into the desert. She ruled for years, and the abomination the Fremen had always feared she might become, the pre-born child who had access to too many ancestral voices, too many lives competing for expression within a single psyche, began to manifest. She could not hold herself. The ancestor voices that lived in her memory were too present, too powerful for a mind that had been born with them, rather than grown into them through years of training. She was lost. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, in the way that all possessions happen, by degrees that each seems small and each leaves something diminished. What replaced her own self at the center was the worst possible candidate, the memory of the Baron Harkonnen, the grandfather she had killed, whose genetic line ran through her mother Jessica, because Jessica had been the Baron's secret daughter, a fact the Bene Gesserit had engineered and concealed. The Baron lived in her ancestral memory, and in Aaliyah's destabilized psyche, he found purchase. He whispered, and she listened, because the alternative was the silence of a self that had never been fully formed. This is the tragedy the Fremen had always feared about the preborn. Not malice, not evil in any simple sense. Just the overwhelming mathematics of 1,000 lives pressing down on one consciousness that wasn't prepared for the weight. And then comes Leto II, Paul's son, born with prescience even more acute than his father's. A child who understood what he was and what the future required of him, in a way that might be the most frightening act of self-awareness in the entire history of the Dune universe. Leto II chose to bond with the sand trout. He allowed the flat, leathery pre-worm creatures to cover his skin, to begin their transformation, to start the process that would eventually make him not fully human. Over years, and then decades, and then centuries, he transformed. The sand trout covering became part of him. He became something with the strength and resilience of a sandworm, with a human mind inside it that retained full consciousness and full memory. He became the God Emperor. Literally, he ruled Arrakis. He ruled the entire Imperium for 3,500 years. From a single fixed point on the planet, from a moving citadel that travelled the desert like a slow worm itself, carried by the Fremen who were now his priests and his servants and his keepers. The ecological transformation was stopped. Leto reversed it. The desert had to be maintained. The worms had to survive. The spice had to flow. And Leto, who could see further forward in time than anyone had ever been able to see, had a reason for all of this that he was not fully explaining to anyone. He called it the Golden Path. The path through time that led to human survival on the scale of 10,000 years or more. The path that required a tyrant, himself, to so thoroughly condition humanity to obedience and stagnation that when the tyrant was finally gone, when the suppression finally ended, humanity would scatter across the galaxy with an urgency born of millennia of enforced stillness. They would spread so wide and so fast that no single force could ever again threaten the species with extinction. Even the prescience that Leto wielded as a tool would be abolished as a danger. He was breeding it out of the human line, selecting against it, ensuring that no future leader could see clearly enough to control the future the way he had. He was building a paradox, a cage that taught the species how to be free. The Fremen, under his reign, changed completely. They became something else. The desert disciplines that had been their survival became ceremonial. The true desert was still there, but the people who lived in it were more comfortable, more settled, more integrated into the imperial structure. They wore still suits as tradition, not necessity. They told the old stories, but they were stories now, not lived experience. Leto watched this and allowed it. He needed the Fremen's wildness to reduce, needed them to lose the edge of their desperation, because the edge would come back after him. It would come back in the scattering, when they spread to the stars and had to start again. The capacity for harshness that the Fremen's ancestors had carried would be present in the human genetic inheritance. He was not doing this for himself. He was doing it for everyone who would come after. Across millennia, they would never know he had planned for. And then, when the time was right, when the breeding program he had quietly maintained had produced the people who could resist prescience, the people who were invisible to his God sight, he allowed himself to die. He fell from his bridge into the sacred water below. The sand trout covering him died on contact with the water. The worm he was becoming died. The 3,500-year reign of the God Emperor ended in a river that hadn't existed on Arrakis before his father had begun the transformation. His death released an enormous quantity of pre-spice mass that had been locked in his body for millennia. A bloom of melange spread from that place. From his body, ultimately, came the generation of new sandworms that eventually repopulated Arrakis, because he had also been carrying the sand trout in his cells, and those were released too, and they began their work again. He died and gave the desert back to itself. The scattering happened after. Humanity exploded outward from the Imperium into the unknown galaxy, exactly as Leto had foreseen. They spread beyond the reach of any empire, any guild, any sisterhood. They became something that could not be controlled, something that could not be threatened with extinction. And Arrakis, Rekis, as it was now called by some, Dune by those who remembered the old name, remained. The desert reclaimed what had been taken from it. The worms grew again in the old deep places. The spice began to flow again, slower at first, then with increasing richness. Pull back now from the events. Let the battles and the politics and the transformations settle. What is Arrakis, really, in the architecture of this story? It is a lesson. The most patient, most brutal, most comprehensive lesson in the canon. The lesson is about what we do with power, not how to get it. The universe is full of stories about that. How to get it, and then what? What happens when you can see the future, and you still cannot avoid becoming what you feared? What happens when a people build something extraordinary in the dark, and the light finally comes and reveals it, and the light changes what it was? What happens when you treat a world as a resource instead of as a place, and the place eventually has something to say about that? The Fremen did not have power in any of the ways the Imperium recognized. They had no great houses, no noble titles, No spacing guild contracts. No Bene Gesserit reverend mothers of their own tradition until Jessica. They had sand and stars, and the memory of people who had already survived everything the universe could think to do to them. And they outlasted every empire that tried to use their home as a coin. The Carinos used Arrakis as a control mechanism and lost their throne. The Harkonnens used it as a money machine and ended in a child's poisoned needle. The Spacing Guild used it as a fuel source and had to watch a 15-year-old boy threaten to take the fuel away and mean it. The Bene Gesserit used it as a proving ground and got something they didn't plan for. A Kwisatz Haderach who arrived a generation early and went entirely off script. Here's what nobody talks about. Arrakis won. In the end, across the full arc of the story, the planet won. Every civilization that came to extract from it was eventually expelled or transformed or made obsolete. The ecological transformation that would have killed the spice was stopped by the worm's own descendant. The empire that tried to exploit it became the empire that served it. The people who tried to erase the Fremen found themselves outnumbered and outmaneuvered by people who had survived worse than them for 3,000 years before they arrived. The desert endures because the desert does not hurry. The sandworms do not hurry either. They have no need to. They live for thousands of years. They see individual human lifespans, the way we might see the movement of a cloud across an afternoon. The great worms, Shai-Hulud, the Fremen call them. Old man of the desert, grandfather of the desert, maker, are not hostile to humans. They are simply indifferent in a way that feels hostile to things that move as fast as we do. But the Fremen learn to respect that indifference and work within it. That's the deepest adaptation of all. Not the still suit, not the sandworm riding, not the thumper or the maker hook, or the precise knowledge of when the worm will surface and when it will dive. The deepest adaptation is the acceptance of the planet's terms. The Fremen did not beat the desert. They became part of it, and in becoming part of it, they became capable of things that no outside force could match. Paul's tragedy was that he knew this and couldn't fully live it. He knew the desert's lesson, but carried the weight of prophecy, which is a kind of impatience, the desire to know the end, to navigate the threads, to avoid the worst outcomes. The prescient mind is always rushing toward or away from something. The desert just is. Leto II learned the lesson more completely. He gave himself to the desert in a way his father never quite managed, literally, biologically, over millennia. But even he was acting on a plan, still trying to control the ark. The golden path was wisdom on a scale that strains belief, but it was still a plan. The desert doesn't plan. Maybe the closest anyone comes to the desert's actual nature in this story is the Fremen who never become famous. The Naib in a sietch that no one names. The woman maintaining the wind trap on a night that will never be recorded. The sandworm rider who goes out alone and doesn't come back, and whose water is returned to the cistern, and whose name is spoken once in the night and not again. They are the planet. They always were. Arrakis is not a backdrop. Arrakis is not a resource. Arrakis is not a test. Arrakis is a world with its own logic, its own history, its own patient and indifferent wisdom. And everything that happens in the story happens on its terms, whether the characters understand that or not. The ones who understood it, even partially, survived. The ones who didn't, well, The desert has a way of clarifying things. Sleep well. The sand will still be there in the morning, and it remembers everything.